Hello, my name is the Sentient Verb, and this is my first YouTube video. I'm simply making this out of an interest for logic, and I've never found myself as a rational thinker in general, so I thought it would be nice if I learned some logic and made a few videos to keep myself going and to stay interested. The book I'm reading right now is called Socratic Logic, and it's by Peter Kreeft. He's a Catholic philosopher, and he's not a big name or anything. In Catholic circles, he is. And he writes textbooks, and this textbook is called Socratic Logic, and he takes an Aristotelian method, like a classic Thomas Aristotelian method to logic. And I already read quite a bit in the book, or this part of the book. And I just wanted to explain a few things that I've read. There's a lot of previous material that I've read, but I'm just going to skip over them. And the previous material is simply just examining the two types of logic, which are the traditional Aristotelian logic and the new modern symbolic logic, how Aristotelian logic is common sense, how the other one isn't common sense, how Aristotelian logic is better for daily use as opposed to the other one. Aristotelian logic is more commonsensical, while the modern logic tends toward skepticism, stuff like that. But we really started to delve into actual material in this area. And Peter Kreeft first starts off with something called the problem of material implication. And first he defines logic as basically reasoning or inference, and it's basically the way how we think in which we draw conclusions from evidence. For example, the classic example is what? My glass cup is shattered on the floor, and my, little brother is next to it. From the evidence of the shattered floor and the past or previous actions of my little brother, I can understand that, he most likely did it. And we move through these, we basically think by moving from proposition to proposition. And the first proposition is called a premise. And the proposition that follows that is called a conclusion. And that is basically it. Logic is what? Basically reasoning. We draw conclusions from evidence. We move from propositions. First proposition we begin with is premise, and the last, the proposition we move to or infer from that is called conclusion. And there's true premises and true conclusions. Now, what is a true premise? Now, Kreeft says that the simplest and most straightforward kind of reasoning is to move from a true premise to a true conclusion. And true premises and true conclusions basically logically follow each other. And you can use fast propositions to find out any flaws in our logical argument. For example, if we have a bunch of false conclusions, false conclusions, but the premises are true, therefore our conclusion is invalid, and we have to look for something else. I'm pretty bad at arguing. This is my first video, so please bear with me. Kreeft then goes through logically valid arguments, and he says what? Conclusion necessarily follows the premises. Then it is a logically valid argument. Then he goes through invalid arguments, what that is. And a true conclusion logically follows, or proved or is implied by it, validly inferred from, or only some premises. And here he goes on, a big talk about modern symbolic logic. This seems to be, his great nemesis in terms of logic. He speaks with a passion against this, which I don't really understand, because I've heard some good things about modern symbolic logic, and he himself esteems it in some ways, but he really likes the traditional logic from what I see. And he goes what? He talks about something called the principle or the paradox of material implication. Now, in logic, there's a premise and there's a conclusion. This relationship between the premise and conclusion is called the implication. And the process by which we move from the premise and to the conclusion is called the inference. And the paradox of material implication is basically this: that the matter or content of the premises and conclusions are basically irrelevant to whether it's true or not. And what he says is, no, in the new logic, which departs from common sense here by totally sundering the rules of logical implication from the matter or content of the propositions involved. It basically doesn't move from concept to concept, whether they logically follow from each other. And he gives an example right here. Logician, so class you see, if you begin with false premise, anything follows. Student, I just can't understand that. Are you sure? And then the logician goes, are you sure you don't understand that? Student, if I understand that, I'm a monkey's uncle. Because, false premise is anything that, doesn't logically follow into a true conclusion. But logician here is saying that, that's fine in terms of what the paradox of material implication. And why is that? Kreeft goes, the relationship between a premise and a conclusion is called implication. And the process of reasoning from the premise to the conclusion is called inference. And there's something in symbolic logic, the relation of implication is called a truth. And so what Kreeft is saying is basically that this symbolic logic, this this truth, as he calls it, this truth functional connective, it operates simply through this if-then proposition. Now, if the premise is true or false, then the conclusion is true or false is basically how it operates. And we substitute conclusion with P, and we substitute premise with P and conclusion with Q. And then he gives us certain, certain scenarios, you could say. If P is true, if premise is true, conclusion is true. If premise is false, conclusion is true. If premise is true, conclusion is false, etc. He gives us these four ways that it could be taken. And we can take the first example, as I said. If the premise or premises are true, then the conclusion is true. And when we plug that into the if and then, we get if P true, then Q true. This would and then we can take a hypothetical scenario and literally anything. And I guess this is what Kreeft says when he says that there is no logical validity, or there's no real life application for this. You literally can connect anything with anything. There is no the content of the premise and conclusion is not what matters, but simply the if-then formula. So you can choose anything in the world for this. Kreeft chooses the grass is green, Mars is red. This is the premise, this is the conclusion. And if the if-then statement is true, if they use this truth functional connective or this relation of implication, if it is correct, then the premise, the grass is green. If the grass is green, then Mars is red is true. And it has to be there. It logically follows from the if-then proposition. It makes no sense, actually. Commonsensically, it makes no sense. But in the symbolic logic, it makes total sense because it literally follows if P is true, then Q is true. And for the second scenario, he gives if the premise is true, then the conclusion is false. And this would be if P, then Q. So if grass is green, then Mars is not red, is false because the conclusion is necessarily false. But the premise is supposed to be true, but it has to follow from each other. Even though they don't have the same content, it should follow from each other. Since the conclusion is false, this would not make sense. This one doesn't work according to symbolic logic. Same with the traditional logic, but we don't go by random material implications. We go by logical validities. The third one, if the premise is false and the conclusion is true. Conclusion here is true, premise is false. We plug it into the if-then. If P is false, Q is true. If P, then Q is true. If grass is purple, then Mars is red. If grass is purple is false, then Mars is red can still be true according to this logic, basically. Premise is false, conclusion is true. If, then proposition summarizing the implication is true. If P is false, then Q is false. If P, then Q is true. So if grass is purple is false and Mars is purple is also false, then I guess they can both work together, basically. Yeah, or if you can say grass is purple, Mars is purple, but that also works together. Even if these statements are both false, they logically can follow according to whatever this material implication says. And I guess that's why Kreeft dislikes it. Even I hate it right now, reading it. It's confusing then, and it kind of is confusing now, but, hopefully I can explain. But then, I'm making this video for fun. I read this like an hour ago, and it's like 2 a.m., but, in the excitement of making the video, I probably should have read more through. But anyways, Kreeft explains here very well, if the premise and conclusion are both false, premise implies a conclusion. Basically, if dogs are red, then the moon is blue. Even if the premise is false, the conclusion is true. If the if-then scenario still follows, which is crazy, but Second one, if the premise is false and the conclusion is true, the premise also implies a conclusion. So if the moon is blue, then the moon is red. If the moon is blue, then the moon is not blue. Yeah, it's just crazy stuff. This makes some defensible sense mathematically, and I'm assuming from that he means if 2 plus 3 equals 5. Honestly, I don't know. I have no idea the defense. That was just hypothetical. But he says this may make some defensible sense mathematically, but it certainly does not make sense commonsensically, for it does not seem to make sense in the real world. And not Aristotle, I think it was Thomas Aquinas who said, truth is the confirmation of the mind to reality. And I guess that makes sense. It might not have been him, and I don't know if that quote is exactly correct, but it makes sense. None of this paradox of material implication, while it can have some true statements, like you can literally make up anything, and it really isn't truth because it doesn't conform the mind to reality. That is, that makes sense. It's just, I think that's the best way to put it from an Thomistic, Aristotelian perspective. And then he goes on to say, logicians haven't answered the above charge. The answer is perfectly tight and logically consistent. This is part of the problem. Consistency is not enough. Logic should just not be a mathematically consistent system, but a human instrument for understanding reality, for dealing with real people and things, and real arguments about the real world. And this is why I wanted to read Kreeft, because he starts off from the traditional logic, and he gives a system that we can use in real life applications. And I really want that, especially, because first thing, symbolic logic seems more boring than this. And, I would like to study logic that is useful for everyday life, that I can use when talking to people, that, to pick apart my own arguments as well as others. And something that is useful and not bland and, isolated to textbooks or, chalkboards. Anyways, thank you. Thank you for watching. That's the end of the video.